Good afternoon. It's my deep pleasure and honor to be able to introduce our next speaker. What a delight in the same day to have William Julius Wilson and Alex Kotlowitz in the same day. To me, it's just amazing. Two individuals who I felt taught me so much over the years that I've studied urban issues and violence. So Alex Kotlowitz is our speaker. Many of you, I hope, have read some of his classic works, nonfiction classics. There Are No Children Here, The Other Side of the River. He is someone who has communicated very powerful stories about race and poverty in such sensitive and insightful ways in so many forms, through his writing in the New York Times Magazine, the New Yorker. I hear him on NPR's This American Life. And he's also contributed to a couple of the most powerful movies, Hoop Dreams, just a fabulous movie. And I first had the honor to meet him when he was teaming up with the rock star of documentaries, Steve James, to make The Interrupters, a powerful story about individuals working in the most stressful conditions to try to stop violence in Chicago. He now teaches at Northwestern University, and I'm very pleased to hear that he's continuing to work on a new book. So without any further ado, Alex.
Thanks. Man, that was a beautiful poem. Poetry is matter. So I want to begin this afternoon, if I could, with a story. And it's about a young girl I met some 30 years ago. Her name was Dede. And when I met her, she was 12 years old. She lived in housing projects, the Henry Horner Homes on the west side of Chicago. And I knew her because she was the cousin of two boys that I was writing about in my first book, There Are No Children Here. And Dede was this, she was this troubled kid. She had a real wild streak about her. She got into fights. She cut school. She had an alcoholic mother and an absent father. And needless to say, I worried about her. But I lost touch with her after the book was done. And I was back visiting the projects some 7 years later. And I happened to run into Dede in a parking lot just outside of the Boys and Girls Club. And she, at this point, was a young woman. She was 19 years old, and she looked horrible. She was emaciated. Her clothes hung off of her like sheets on a clothesline. Her hair was a mess. She was leaning against the hood of a car, kind of falling in and out of sleep. She barely acknowledged my presence, and it was clear to me that she had become addicted to crack. I gave her a hug, but I didn't want to hold her too hard because she was so skinny. I feared that I would hurt her, and honestly, I figured that this would be the last time I'd see her. She looked about as close to death as one could get without actually dying. She was just gone, completely swallowed by the ravages of her community. So I want to fast forward to about 7 or 8 years ago. I had gotten a phone call that Dede's younger brother, Porkchop, who I had also known, who was now in his 20s, had been shot, accidentally shot coming out of a liquor store on the city's west side, and he was in the hospital. And so I rushed over to the hospital, and when I got there, I was standing in line in the lobby waiting to get a pass to go visit him. And as I was there, this young woman, very handsomely dressed, tapped me on the shoulder and turned around, and she was smiling. And I am not very good with faces, and trust me, it doesn't get any easier. And I said to her, you know, I'm sorry, but I can't, I know I should recognize you, but I just can't place who you are. And she started to laugh and said, it's Dede. And she threw her arms around me, and I was smiling as well. And as we waited in line there, she very quickly told me her story. She remembered our encounter in the parking lot outside that Boys and Girls Club, and she indeed was a prisoner of crack. And then she told me about a year later she had a child, a daughter, and everything changed. She began going to church. She met a man at church, a truck driver who became her husband, who was standing by her side here in the hospital lobby. And here she was, completely filled out, bright-eyed, so pointed, so smart. I couldn't stop smiling. And I tell this story up front to caution us against what the Nigerian-born novelist Chimamanda Adichie calls the danger of the single story. The danger of thinking that people have a single narrative. That, for instance, if you're growing up poor on Chicago's West Side or in Baltimore's Park Heights, that your story is the same as the person next door. Or that because you're poor, we think we know your story. Or in the case of Dede, because you're poor and a drug addict, that we think we know the shape of your narrative. As Adichie warns, show people one way over and over again, and that's what they become. I mention this before anything else because stories are essential to understanding who we are. Stories are how we make sense of the world, how we make sense of our own lives and of those around us. Think about it. Stories inform policy. They inform the way we allocate resources. They inform the way we think about ourselves and others. They inform the present and help sculpt the future. And so we need to take care not to craft a single narrative, not to pigeonhole people, not to think we already know when in fact we know very little. We need to be willing to be knocked off balance, to be astonished, to have our assumptions poked and prodded, even directly challenged. We need to recognize the danger of the single narrative. Adichie suggests that stories, if not told honestly, lead to a lazy, simplified view of the world. And so what I hope to do today is to talk about the profound poverty in our cities, and to do so honestly, at least honest to what I've seen and heard, and to do so in a manner that respects the messy vitalities of the American landscape. I've got to say that I'm honored to be speaking to a group of people like yourselves who are so concerned about our disenfranchised, about our marginalized, about our poor, a group of people so concerned about maintaining our social compact. For I don't need to tell you this, but talking about such matters, thinking about such matters, acting on such matters has fallen out of favor in America, or at least in much of America. Not only do we have a difficult time talking about poverty in this country, especially poverty in our cities, but we've made things harder for those at the bottom. We've dismantled the traditional safety nets. Public housing in many of our cities has been raised, much of the replacement housing still a far-off dream. Welfare has been virtually eliminated. Many heatedly oppose adequate health care to those without. There's little conversation around the unbearably high foreclosure rate in our central cities, a remnant still of the 2008 housing crash. There's little effort to alleviate the unemployment rate, which in some communities hovers around 25%, or little opposition to the unconscionable practices of payday lenders who charge anywhere from between 200 to 500% for loans to people who have nowhere else to turn. There is a woeful lack of discourse among our political and business leaders on these matters. And yet we're a country that likes to imagine itself as one that's fair and just, one that's filled with compassion, one that reaches out to those less fortunate. So what I want to do is to share with you some stories which I hope can help us reflect on the nature of poverty in the world's richest nation, stories that push us to hear to see and hear those whose lives are sculpted not by the exhilaration of opportunity, but rather constricted by the burden of circumstance. And I want to talk with you about the myths that we hold and how those myths can often get in the way. So let me begin with a couple of sobering thoughts. When I began work on There Are No Children Here some 30 years ago, the children poverty rate in this country was 20%. 1 in every 5 children in this country grew up poor. And it was incredibly big news at the time. Well, that number has remained the same. Still, 1 out of every 5 children grow up in poverty in this country. And yet there's little anger and fury about that. A few years ago, I had the honor to show our film, The Interrupters, which I'll talk about a little bit later, but it's a film about the violence in Chicago. And we showed the film at Danville Prison, a medium security prison in central Illinois. It was the only screening I've shown where we had to keep the lights on during the showing. And we had about 200 men in the room, all inmates in the prison. And afterwards, there was some time for Q&A. And the first 2 men to get up, one of them had been in prison for 21 years, the other for 18 years. And the reason I knew this is because they were both near tears. Both of them had grown up in Englewood, one of the neighborhoods featured in the film. And they were just distraught by how much worse it looked than when they had gone off to prison. That's what we're up against. The possibility that not only are things not getting better, but that in fact they're only getting worse. The 2 most critical institutions, I think, in our neighborhoods, in any neighborhood, are family and schools. And families, as we know, and we're going to talk about this on the panel afterwards, so I won't spend much time addressing it now, but families, as we know, in these communities are often deeply fractured. Children being raised by a single mother or grandmother, a father off in prison, older siblings tempted by the streets. We're talking to families of parents who often crumble under the weight of the unbearable forces bearing down on them. And so we turn our hopes to the other essential institution in any community, and that is our schools. And in many neighborhoods, they're the one institution remaining that still has a sense of respect and dignity. It's a place, I would argue, where children want to be. For many, it's a place of refuge, of safety, it's a place of community, and it's a place where we imagine our children can find opportunity. And yet this notion of school as an institution that somehow levels the playing field is more myth than truth. We so believe in the transformative power of education, that school is so central to this American myth of self-transcendence. But for all the money and thought and resources that we've poured into our schools in impoverished neighborhoods, we've done little to raise the trajectory of those growing up in these communities. And so the question we have to ask, why is that? And I would suggest that one of the main reasons is that we haven't paid enough attention to what's happening outside the walls of our schools. And that if we're serious about reforming education as a place where one can step up in life, that we must look at that which is taking place outside the school walls. We can't do this piecemeal. Education cannot be our sole anti-poverty program. Those who teach know this better than anyone. They're not dealing only with the children in the confines of their classrooms, but they're also contending with everything else going on in their lives. Fractured families, violence witnessed, violence experienced, going without, facing racism, living in distressed housing, facing evictions. Our children don't enter that school building every morning and leave behind all that bears down on them. Rather, it follows them. It distracts them. It pushes and pulls at them. It permeates their very soul. So let me begin, if I could, by addressing what I believe are a couple of myths about the entrenched poverty of our cities. One of those myths, I think, is that in these neighborhoods there's a very strong sense of community. But in fact, what I see are communities that have begun to fray, communities that have begun to unravel. I remember when I first began to spend time in the Henry Horner Homes, this public housing project on Chicago's West Side, I expected people to distrust me. Here I was, an outsider by race, by class. But what I didn't expect to find was also neighbors that distrusted neighbors. And I always remember Lafayette, the older of the two boys. He was 12 years old. When I asked Lafayette if he wouldn't introduce me to some of his friends, Lafayette said to me, "I don't have friends, I just have associates, friends you trust." These are communities, as Bill Wilson has eloquently written about, in which work, meaningful work, has virtually disappeared. And I would argue, and I think Bill Wilson would argue, that work is the very thread that holds the social fabric together. You think about it, there's the reality of work and the culture of work. And the reality of work is rather obvious. It provides income for food, shelter, and clothing. But there's also the culture of work. Think about it. Work gives us a sense of purpose, a sense of identity, a connection to the world around us. It provides order. It gives us a beginning, middle, and end to our days. So without work, without jobs, people lose that sense of purpose, a sense of self. Their days begin to melt into each other. Without work, people feel disconnected from themselves and from those around them. It's also important to acknowledge that these are communities that are physically and spiritually isolated from the rest of us. Somebody earlier today referred to the two Baltimores, and I often think of my own city, Chicago, as a kind of tale of two cities. These are communities that have little to do with the rest of us. And it's important that we turn to history to understand this, to remind us that this is not some accident. You look at the history, for example, of public housing. Public housing in Chicago, the bulk of it built in the 1950s and early 1960s. White politicians didn't want them built in their neighborhoods, and as a result, these high-rises were built at the edge of already existing black ghettos and served as a kind of bulwark to segregation. And then in places like Baltimore and in my city, Chicago, we have the history of restrictive covenants that limited where blacks could live. We had a federal housing administration that often refused mortgages to blacks. Segregation is alive and well in our cities, racial segregation. And as Nicole Hannah-Jones has exposed in her brilliant reporting in the New York Times and in This American Life, and as just last week the Metropolitan Planning Council and the Urban Institute in a study revealed, segregation diminishes the possibilities for African Americans. The Urban Institute last week in the report concluded that if cities could reduce their levels of segregation, income for blacks would rise, more students would graduate high school, and the homicide rate would drop precipitously. All of these contribute to this kind of breakdown or fraying of community. Back in the mid-'80s, Mother Teresa came and visited the west side of Chicago, in fact, the very neighborhood that I was reporting in. And she was really knocked off balance by what she saw, and not by the poverty of the pocketbook, because she had certainly seen worse in India, but what she called the poverty of the spirit. These are communities that are fraying. There's another myth that's directly related to this, and that is the violence, which has been so stubborn and so persistent in so many of our cities. And there's this myth out there that somehow people acclimate to the violence or get hardened by it. And I would argue that we have completely underestimated the effect of the violence on both the spirit of individuals and on the spirit of community. I would argue that it's one single act of violence around which the rest of a childhood will revolve. The numbers are just unimaginable, staggering, really. In my city, Chicago, in the past 25 years, We've had 16,394 people killed, and another 60,000 people wounded by gunfire. What happens to a city or parts of a city assaulted like this day after day, week after week, year after year? Think about it. The violence is so pervasive that it forms its own culture. It puts communities and residents on the defensive, just the language, the signage, even the dress and the rituals. When a murder occurs, street shrines arise during the summer with the ubiquity of perennials, and they stand as monuments to the deceased, a kind of community catharsis. Friends and family leave stuffed animals or liquor and beer bottles or notes of love and prayer. The acronym RIP, Rest in Peace, has become so ever-present that you find it not only on these makeshift shrines, but also tattooed on people's bodies, painted on the walls of apartments, scrawled on the sides of buildings, embossed in T-shirts and jackets. It's as if communities are piecing together the equivalent of a war memorial. If you listen closely to the language of our youth, it reflects what they're up against. A few years ago, I was visiting a Lawndale Christian Academy, a public school, despite its name, on the west side of Chicago, and I was there visiting the principal, who I've known for a long time, Myra Sampson, and it was morning, and she was going around the school building kind of poking her head into the classrooms and saying good morning to the students, and she'd always ask, the students, how are you doing? And inevitably, the young men would respond simply, staying out of trouble. As Myra has said to me later, that's often what their parents say to them as they leave the house. Stay out of trouble. In other words, keep your head up, look around you, be cautious, stay safe. I want to show you some photos here. See if I can. Great. So these are, I don't know whether Baltimore has block clubs or not, but there are these, the concept is kind of self-evident that the groups of people on a single street or block form a block club, and it's really an effort to try to, to beautify the street, to hold barbecues, create a sense of community. And you look at these photos, so these are photos that I've taken of block club signs on the west and south sides of the city. And these block clubs are ordinarily a mark of celebration. And yet here they announce all their intentions, not in language that speaks to their dreams, but rather language that speaks to their fears. These are communities, to borrow a term from the world of psychology, that are hypervigilant. They're wary and weary. They're collectively looking over their shoulder. How can they focus on what might be when their energy is on what is? These are communities that live entirely in the present and trying to fend off the future. In recent years, there's been this robust and urgent conversation about how we can best assist soldiers returning from combat in Iraq and Afghanistan. And many, as we now well know, suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. And yet we've neglected those here, those whose emotional wounds fester. A few years ago, I was part of a two-part series for the public radio show This American Life, in which we spent 6 months in a high school, Harper High, on the south side of Chicago. And the reason we had gone to Harper was because the year before, during the school year, they had 21 current and former students who had been shot and wounded by gunfire, and another 7 who had been killed. And so we went to this school to look at how a place tries to right itself after this horrific year. And we get to the school. I was there with 2 other reporters, and I quickly kind of fell in love with these 2 social workers, Anita and Crystal, who were just filled with life and clearly had the respect of the students in that school. And so for the next 6 months, I did nothing but just sort of hang out with Anita and Crystal in their windowless office in the middle of the school building. And I got there in the middle of August when school had reopened, and just 2 months earlier, just before school let out in the middle of June, a sophomore, Chika Asif, had been sitting on a front porch with her best friend Thomas, and it was an abandoned building, and as they were there talking and laughing, somebody ran out from the gangway on the side of the building and came out in front and started shooting and shot Chika. And Thomas was with her on that porch, and all he remembers is Chika just yelling out, "It burns, it burns," and she died on the way to the hospital. Now, Thomas is somebody who had already witnessed a number of other shootings, including a shooting that paralyzed one of his older brothers, and another time when he was at a surprise birthday party at the age of 10 when a stray bullet entered the living room window and shot and killed the birthday girl. And Thomas told me that in those days after Chika's death, he couldn't sleep. He couldn't sleep at all. And about a week later, he punched someone. And he concedes that it was over nothing. An older boy had pushed his younger cousin. And so Thomas hit this older boy and hit him so hard that one of the teeth from the boy embedded in Thomas's hand. And he told me that once he hurt his hand, he could sleep again. It was that simple. Getting in this stupid fight brought him some sense of relief. And I was in that social worker's office a lot, and Thomas seemed to always be there, because he especially leaned on Anita, which was kind of like a second mother to him. And at one point, Anita tries to get Thomas to open up about what he's seen. So I want to play this for you here. What's that? Sorry, no, it's up here. Yeah, there we go. There we go. Try to hurt somebody. This is something Thomas would say a lot. One time when I asked where he thought he might be in 10 years, he said I might be in jail because I think I'm going to hurt someone. Mostly it felt like tough talk, like teenage bravado. But I came to realize that it wasn't just tough guy bragging. I began to realize that Thomas was trying as best he could to be honest about some feelings he has, feelings that scare him. You experience violence in the way that Thomas does, and the world begins to look hostile. You're always on guard, waiting for the next assault, waiting for the next shooting, and the anger, as it does in Thomas, just builds and builds and builds. You walk into a classroom in just about any Central City high school and ask how many have lost a loved one to violence or have witnessed a shooting, and virtually every hand will go up. And most will tell you that they've never talked about it. In fact, children are often discouraged from talking about what they've seen out of fear that if they do, they somehow will be held culpable for the crime. I've encountered children who've had flashbacks, who suffer from depression, who have physical ailments resulting from the stress. Lafayette, in my first book, would get regular stomach aches. Farrow had a stutter that would only worsen when the gunfire became more frequent. And then there were others like Thomas who were just filled with rage. The violence and breakdown of community are intertwined. They feed on each other. Where there's violence, people pull inward, they become distrustful, they come to see the world as hostile, and in communities that have broken down, the terrain becomes ripe for violence. And so, needless to say, we need to find ways to rebuild and fortify community and family. If we do nothing to reduce the shootings, if we do nothing to bring meaningful work into these communities, if we do nothing to interrupt the legacy of incarceration, if we do nothing to rebuild the infrastructure, if we do nothing to provide adequate housing and health care, if we do nothing to invest and integrate our schools, will make little or no difference in the lives of those whose sense of promise flickers rather than burns bright. But this all feels so obvious, so self-evident, that the real question is, where has everyone been? And so I just want to conclude by talking about something that I think is really essential that we acknowledge, and that's this kind of silence that surrounds these neighborhoods. And there are two kinds of silences I want to address. One which I think is pretty obvious is kind of institutional silence. Inability of institutions like the police, healthcare, schools to respond to what's become a weekly, if not daily, crisis in the lives of many of these kids. And I always remember, again, when I was working on There Are No Children here, I would come after school in those first few months to the Boys and Girls Club, and that's where I got to meet the kids that I ended up writing about. And I came over one afternoon, and the projects were eerily silent. And as I got there, the adults were emerging from the buildings, and they told me that two rival gangs had been shooting at each other from high-rise to high-rise, like naval ships at sea. And I then went into the Boys and Girls Club, and the kids told me the same story. And I was a reporter at the time for the Wall Street Journal, and being a good reporter, I called the police department the next morning to verify that, in fact, this had taken place. And I talked to a spokeswoman there. I told her what I had heard. She said, "I'll get back to you." And a couple of hours later, she calls me back. And she told me that every morning the police superintendent would have a conference call with all the police commanders in the city where they would talk about just such incidents. And she assured me that no such incident had been talked about that morning, and that probably what I had heard had not happened. So I went back out to the community. The adults and the kids told me the same story. And in fact, the beat police officers there not only confirmed that it had happened, but told me they initially thought they were the targets of the shooting and had taken cover under their squad cars. And that's the kind of institutional silence I'm talking about. And often it serves a kind of purpose. If the police don't acknowledge that such a shooting has taken place, it gives them reason not to be in that community. But the other kind of silence for me, which is a much more subtle kind of silence, but no less important, is a kind of self-imposed silence on the part of people living in these communities. An unwillingness, if you will, to share their stories. And what I came to realize over time is much of this unwillingness, I think, is this fear that if they share their stories, they won't be believed. And I will tell you, I've encountered this time and time again. And I can remember shortly after There Are No Children Here came out, we were fortunate, Oprah made it into a TV movie. And so when the screenwriter came out from New York, I was to be kind of his tour guide, to introduce him to the neighborhood and the people I wrote about. And so he was this very quiet, soft-spoken, gentle guy. And as I spent time with him, I began to get this feeling that he didn't believe all that I'd written. So I took him to the worst of the high-rises. I introduced him to the biggest of the gang members and the biggest of the drug dealers. And on the fourth and last day, he and I and two friends of mine, two women who lived and worked at a neighboring housing complex, went out to lunch at a restaurant, Edna's, on the west side. And as we were sitting in our booth, a young boy, maybe 13, 14 years of age, ran into the restaurant and ducked behind the heating grill. And as he ducked, a group of boys walked by, and one of them pulled a pistol out of a brown paper bag and started shooting. And needless to say, we were scared for our lives. We ducked under our table, and I remember as we lay there, literally one on top of the other, all I could think to myself is, now he's going to believe me. And I mention this because I think this kind of self-imposed silence is the most painful kind of silence there is, and is a kind of silence that will slowly sap the spirit out of the most spirited people. And what it says to me is something very, very simple. We've stopped listening. we stop believing. And so when people ask me, where do we go from here, I tell them we need to start listening. We need to start believing. We need to start telling stories. You think about it, telling stories does two things. One, it introduces us to people we might otherwise might not meet, brings us to communities we might not venture into. But the other part of it is stories make us feel less alone. They give credence to our own personal and collective histories. I'm not so naive to think that storytelling will build new housing or create new jobs or push politicians to act differently. But what it will do is place us in the shoes of others. It will create empathy. Empathy is the centripetal force of storytelling, and it's also the centripetal force of community. And needless to say, we are a country deeply lacking at the moment in empathy. We need to hear stories, the unpredictable stories of those whose voices have been lost amidst the cacophonous noise of ideologues and rhetorical ruffians. And we need to be honest to what we see, and we need to get knocked off balance. We need to get filled with indignant fury at what these kids are up against, and get to know them as they know each other. You know, too often we speak in shorthand of gangbangers and thugs, of teenage moms and at-risk youth, of ex-felons and of drug addicts. Remember Dede? I thought I knew her, but I didn't. So when we began, I mentioned in my film, The Interrupters, we spent 14 months following 3 individuals who work for an organization, Chicago Ceasefire, which is similar to what you have here in Baltimore, Safe Streets. You know, men and women formerly of the street who go out and interrupt disputes before they turn into something violent. And one of the people we followed is actually, some of you here in Baltimore may know him, is a young man, Kobe Williams. And Kobe called us one night to tell us that he had gotten a call from a young man named Flamo, who he had met years ago in the county jail. And Flamo had a reputation on the streets as a real renegade, someone you didn't want to mess with. And it turns out that someone had called the police on Flamo and reported that he had guns in his house. And when the police came, he wasn't home, but they ended up arresting his brother and handcuffing his mother. And Flamo was enraged, and he had called Kobe to let him know that all this had happened. And so Kobe was rushing over there, and he called us and told us that we should come and join him. And so I just want to show a short film clip of this moment when Kobe, with us in tow, get over to Flamo's. So Kobe did something so simple here that it almost feels laughable. You know, he invites Flamo out to lunch, and then he takes him to a meeting of the interrupters, and then a few weeks later he takes him out to dinner. He stayed with him, and I'm not going to give away the film, but let me just tell you that we stayed with Flamo as well, and I think you'll find his journey and trajectory somewhat surprising. And in the end, I came to realize that all Flamo needed was someone to listen to his story, someone to acknowledge his grievance, someone to believe in him. And Kobe knew this instinctually from his own life. And it's moments like this that remind us there is no single narrative. There is no single story. You know, over the course of the 14 months that we filmed, it became apparent that the one constant for those like Kobe and Flamo, for those who were able to emerge from the wreckage of their lives and their neighborhoods, was to have someone who carried high expectations for them, someone who treated them with a sense of dignity and decency, someone who saw them for who they are, full, rich, nuanced, complicated individuals whose lives and stories don't neatly fit into some predetermined slot. Kobe saw in Flamo something more than just an angry young man. And as Chris Wilson suggested earlier, this is the challenge for all of us, to not define others by their circumstance or by a moment in their lives, but rather to come to know them for who they are. Thank you.